Hello everyone, I am Mr. Brian. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. It started so innocently. I had just moved into this small, quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you imagine when you think of suburban perfection. Clean streets, neat little houses, lawns trimmed just right, and white picket fences. Everyone greeted each other with a smile and a wave, and the sound of birds chirping in the morning was the loudest thing you'd hear. It was so peaceful that it almost felt like a movie set, the kind of place where nothing ever goes wrong. That was exactly what I was looking for after the chaos of my divorce. Sarah had taken everything, the house, most of our friends, even our dog. The only thing she'd left me was a bruised ego and a desperate need for somewhere quiet to rebuild my life. When I found 42 Maple Street, a modest two-bedroom colonial with blue shutters and a small front porch, it felt like salvation. The real estate agent, a chatty woman named Miss Simpson, had gushed about the neighborhood's safety record and community spirit. "You'll love it here," she'd said, jangling her keys as we walked through the empty rooms. "It's like stepping back in time to when neighbors actually cared about each other." The house smelled of fresh paint and possibility. Hardwood floors gleamed under afternoon sunlight, streaming through clean windows. The kitchen was small but functional, with white cabinets and a window that looked out onto the backyard, a neat square of grass bordered by a chain-link fence. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Moving day had been uneventful. The movers worked efficiently, and by evening, most of my belongings were stacked in labeled boxes throughout the house. I'd managed to set up my bed and unpack enough kitchen supplies to make coffee. As the sun began to set, I stepped onto my front porch with a steaming mug, surveying my new domain with satisfaction. The street was picture perfect in the golden hour light. Children's bicycles lay abandoned on sidewalks, and the distant sound of a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the block. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had brought over a casserole earlier, welcoming me with genuine warmth. The Johnsons next door to her had waved from their garden where they were tending to prize-winning roses. But then he moved in. I first saw him one evening when I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the last bit of quiet before the day ended. The house next door, 44 Maple Street, had been empty since I'd moved in 3 weeks earlier. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned the previous owners had relocated suddenly for work, leaving the place vacant for months. There he was, lugging boxes into the house next door. At first glance, he seemed like just another guy moving in, tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders that suggested manual labor or regular gym visits. Scruffy, a little disheveled, he had this thick, unkempt beard that looked like he hadn't bothered to shave in weeks, and his clothes were rumpled as though he hadn't even thought to change out of his old sweatshirt and jeans. What struck me first was how alone he seemed. No moving truck, no friends or family helping, just him, carrying box after box from a beat-up white van parked in his driveway. The boxes looked heavy, and he moved with a deliberate mechanical rhythm that seemed almost obsessive. But there was something about him that didn't quite fit in with the rest of the neighborhood. It was hard to put my finger on it. But his movements were off, not in an overt way, just a slight difference, like he was marching to the beat of a different drummer. While everyone else in Maple Street moved with the casual ease of people comfortable in their environment, there was something rigid about his posture, something calculated about the way he surveyed the street before heading back to his van. I watched him work for about an hour, occasionally lifting my hand in a neighborly wave when he looked in my direction. He never waved back. never even acknowledged me. Just that steady mechanical process of unloading boxes, each one carried with the same measured pace. When Mrs. Patterson emerged from her house to water her flower boxes, she too noticed the new arrival. I saw her pause, garden hose in hand, watching him with the kind of curious interest that longtime residents reserve for newcomers. But when she called out a friendly welcome to the neighborhood, he didn't respond, didn't even look her way. Mrs. Patterson glanced over at me with a puzzled expression and shrugged. Not everyone was social after all. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar creaks and settles of my new house, I found myself thinking about my new neighbor. Something nagged at me. Not alarm exactly, but a vague unease that I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was just the contrast between his antisocial behavior and the overwhelming friendliness of everyone else on Maple Street. I tried to push the feeling aside. I was overthinking things, probably still adjusting to life after Sarah. Moving to a new place always came with its share of anxiety and hypervigilance. Besides, not everyone had to be chatty and social. Some people preferred to keep to themselves, and that was perfectly normal. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the memory of those boxes. They'd all been the same size, same weight, based on how he carried them, and despite moving for hours, I'd never seen any furniture. No couch, no bed, no refrigerator, just boxes. Dozens and dozens of identical boxes. What does someone fill 40 identical boxes with? The question followed me into my dreams, where I found myself standing at my bedroom window, watching him carry box after box into that house, an endless procession that never seemed to end. I didn't think much of it at first. New neighbors were nothing special. People came and went all the time. But then I started seeing him more, and more disturbingly, he wasn't just moving boxes around anymore. He was out in his yard all the time, standing still, staring at me. The first time I noticed it was 3 days after he'd moved in. I'd gone out to get my morning newspaper, one of those old-fashioned routines I'd adopted as part of my simpler life resolution, and there he was, standing in his backyard, completely motionless, facing my house, not gardening, not surveying his new property, just standing there with his hands at his sides watching. Our eyes met across the small expanse of our adjoining yards, and I felt something cold crawl up my spine. His gaze was intense, unwavering, like a predator studying its prey. I lifted my hand in what I hoped was a casual wave, but he didn't respond, didn't even blink, just kept staring. I grabbed my newspaper and hurried back inside, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just getting familiar with his surroundings. People did that, right? Surveyed their new territory? But it happened again the next morning, and the next. Whether it was day or night, it didn't matter. His gaze was always on me, like he was waiting for something. At first, it was easy to brush it off as nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But soon it became harder to ignore. It wasn't just occasional glances anymore. It was constant. I'd walk out to get the mail, and there he'd be, staring from his window, not even bothering to pretend he wasn't watching. When I worked in my small garden, pulling weeds or watering the few plants the previous owner had left behind, I could feel his eyes on me, that eerie prickle at the back of my neck, like I was being scrutinized, like he was studying me. The watching had a quality that unsettled me in ways I couldn't articulate. It wasn't the casual curiosity of a neighbor getting to know the area. This was something else entirely. Focused, deliberate, invasive. He would stand at his kitchen window while I made my morning coffee, his silhouette clearly visible against the white curtains. When I sat on my porch in the evening, trying to enjoy the peaceful suburban atmosphere that had drawn me here. I'd catch glimpses of him at his front window, partially hidden behind the blinds but unmistakably present. I tried telling myself I was being paranoid. People stare. It's not unusual. Maybe he was just a little odd, perhaps socially awkward or dealing with his own transition to the neighborhood. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. It wasn't just a casual glance. It was a steady, unblinking gaze that made my skin crawl. The worst part was the timing. He seemed to know exactly when I'd be outside. If I stepped onto my porch at 7 a.m. for my coffee, he'd already be at his window, waiting. If I came home from work at 6:30 p.m., there he'd be in his yard, motionless as a statue. It was as if he'd memorized my schedule, anticipating my every movement. I began to change my routines, hoping to break whatever pattern he'd established. I'd get my mail at different times, vary my morning routine, take different routes when walking around the neighborhood. But somehow, he always seemed to know, always seemed to be watching. Mrs. Patterson noticed it too. "Have you met the new fellow?" she asked one afternoon, when I encountered her at our shared mailbox cluster at the end of the street. "Not formally," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. "He seems to keep to himself." She lowered her voice, glancing toward his house. "I've tried welcoming him 3 times now, brought over a casserole, some fresh cookies, even offered to help with his lawn care. He won't answer his door, but I see him watching from the windows." She paused, her weathered face creasing with concern. "It's peculiar. In 40 years of living here, I've never had a neighbor who wouldn't at least acknowledge a greeting." The validation of my concerns should have been reassuring, but instead, it amplified my unease. If Mrs. Patterson, a woman who'd successfully welcomed every resident on Maple Street for 4 decades, found his behavior strange, then my instincts weren't simply paranoid overthinking. That evening, I decided to confront the situation directly. If he was just shy or dealing with social anxiety, maybe a friendly conversation would break the ice and eliminate the uncomfortable tension that had begun to color my every moment outside the house. I walked over to his front door, my heart beating faster than the simple action warranted. His lawn was bare dirt and patches of dying grass, a stark contrast to the manicured yards that defined our street. No welcome mat, no decorative touches, nothing that suggested human habitation beyond the bare minimum. I knocked 3 times, a friendly rhythm that I hoped conveyed neighborly interest rather than confrontation. Silence. I could hear movement inside, footsteps, the creak of floorboards, but no one came to the door. I knocked again, a little louder this time. "Hello? I'm David from next door. Just wanted to introduce myself." The footsteps stopped, complete silence, as if whoever was inside had frozen, waiting for me to leave. I stood there for several minutes, feeling increasingly foolish and more than a little disturbed. The sensation of being watched intensified, and I had the distinct impression that he was observing me from somewhere inside the house, choosing not to respond. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement in the upstairs window. Just a brief shadow passing behind the curtain, but when I looked directly at the window, there was nothing. Walking back to my house, the feeling of invisible eyes following my every step was so strong that I found myself walking faster, almost jogging by the time I reached my front door. That night, I double-checked all my locks for the first time since moving to Maple Street. Then one evening, things took a turn that shattered any remaining illusions of normal neighborly oddness. I had just finished dinner and was getting ready for bed when I heard it. At first, it was soft, almost like a breeze had brushed against the window. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. My blood ran cold. I froze, not sure whether to move or stay still. I stared at the kitchen window, my heart racing. Tap, tap, tap. It was deliberate, almost rhythmic, like someone was trying to get my attention. The sound came from the window that faced his yard, the same window where I'd often seen his silhouette watching me during my morning routine. I held my breath, hoping it was just some random noise, maybe a tree branch swaying in the wind. But then I heard it, a faint voice, as though it was coming from just outside the glass. "Come out and play." The words were barely above a whisper, but in the silence of my house, they rang out with startling clarity. My skin erupted in goosebumps, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. What kind of person says something like that? The phrase itself was innocent enough, something a child might say to a friend, but delivered in that low adult voice at night through my kitchen window, it carried implications that made my stomach turn. I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. Part of me wanted to go to the window, to confront whoever was out there, but a larger part, the part that had kept our species alive for millennia by recognizing danger, screamed at me to stay away. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. Tap, 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 tap. "Come out and play." Louder now, more demanding. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the window on trembling legs. The kitchen was dark. I hadn't turned on the lights after dinner, preferring the peaceful ambiance of evening shadows. Now that darkness felt like a protective barrier between me and whatever was outside. Slowly, carefully, I parted the curtain just enough to peer out. Nothing. The backyard was empty, silver washed under moonlight, no figure lurking by the fence, no one crouched beneath the window, just the quiet expanse of grass and the dark bulk of his house beyond, every window black and lifeless. But as I stood there, scanning the shadows, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving along the side of my house. They paused directly below my kitchen window, and the silence stretched so long, I began to wonder if I'd imagined the entire thing. Then, "I know you're watching." The voice was directly below me now, maybe 6 feet away through the thin barrier of wall and glass. Close enough that I could hear the slight rasp in his breathing. Close enough that if the window had been open, we could have had a normal conversation. I jerked back from the curtain, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. The rational part of my mind suggested calling the police, but what would I tell them? A neighbor had knocked on my window and spoken to me. That wasn't illegal. Weird and unsettling, certainly, but not criminal. The footsteps resumed, circling my house with methodical precision. I tracked their progress by sound, along the side yard, around the back, up the other side. He was taking inventory, learning the layout, mapping escape routes and entry points. When the footsteps finally faded, I remained frozen in my dark kitchen for another hour, listening to every creak and settle of the house, waiting for any sign of his return. I thought about calling the police, but quickly dismissed the idea. After all, he hadn't actually done anything threatening, right? It could all just be a weird misunderstanding. Maybe he had some kind of mental condition that made social interaction difficult. Maybe the whole thing was innocent, and I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I found something that eliminated any possibility of innocent explanation. In my front yard, positioned carefully on the walkway where I couldn't miss it, was a doll. Not just any doll, but one of those antique porcelain ones, with a cracked face and glassy, unblinking eyes. The kind that belonged in a Victorian child's bedroom, or, more recently, in a horror movie. The doll's dress had once been white, but was now stained and yellowed with age. Its painted smile had chipped away in places, giving it a grotesque, gap-toothed grin. But it was the eyes that truly disturbed me, pale blue glass that seemed to track movement, creating the illusion of consciousness and malevolent intelligence. I knew it wasn't there the day before. I'd walked this same path to get my morning newspaper, and I would have noticed something so out of place. My heart skipped a beat as I approached it, every instinct screaming at me not to touch the thing. But tucked under the doll's ragged dress, I spotted a folded piece of paper. With trembling hands, I extracted the note and unfolded it. The message was written in block letters with black ink. "Come play with me, or I'll come to you." No name, no explanation, just those chilling words that transformed what might have been a childhood invitation into something far more sinister. I looked up, my pulse quickening, and for a moment, I knew he was watching. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his presence like a weight against my skin. Behind those dark windows of his house, behind the curtains that never seemed to be fully open, eyes were locked on me, studying my reaction, feeding off my fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a prank anymore. This was something far more unsettling, something that suggested careful planning and deliberate psychological manipulation. And that's when everything started to unravel. The fear settled in like a thick fog, clouding my judgment and poisoning the peace I'd come to Maple Street to find. That night, I called in sick to work for the first time since moving. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus on anything, except the growing certainty that I was being hunted. A few nights later, at 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of knocking. Knock, knock, knock. Steady, persistent, echoing through my house like the beating of some enormous heart. I glanced at the clock, disoriented, and felt my stomach drop. 3 a.m. Who knocks on someone's door at this hour? My heart was racing, my breath shallow. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. The scenes where the victim makes the fatal mistake of opening the door to whatever waits in the darkness. I crept toward the front door, terrified of what I might find, but unable to ignore the sound. Each step felt like walking through molasses, my body fighting against approaching what every instinct identified as danger. I peered through the peephole, my eye pressed against the small lens that offered a fisheye view of my front porch. Nothing, just the empty, shadowed porch under the weak glow of my exterior light. The street beyond was dark and silent. No cars, no movement, no sign of life anywhere. But the knocking didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. Different now. Lighter, coming from a different direction. My blood froze as I realized the sound was coming from the back of the house. I moved through my house like a ghost, avoiding the windows, keeping to the shadows. The knocking moved with me, always staying just out of sight, always coming from whichever direction I wasn't facing. Kitchen window. Tap, tap, tap. Dining room. Knock, knock, knock. Living room. Tap, 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 tap. He was circling the house, playing some kind of sick game, testing my reactions, measuring my fear. I slowly opened the front door, just enough to see the front step. The porch light cast long, eerie shadows across the wooden planks, but there was no one there. The night was too quiet. No crickets, no distant traffic, even the wind had stopped. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. My eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any movement, any sign of the person who'd been tormenting me. The street lamps created pools of yellow light, separated by vast stretches of impenetrable shadow. He could be anywhere, hidden behind any tree, crouched beside any car. As I began to close the door, a voice, low, menacing, whispered from directly behind me, "Don't you ever ignore me again." I whipped around, my heart in my throat. But there was no one, not a single soul. The interior of my house was empty, just familiar furniture, casting familiar shadows in the dim light from the porch. Yet I could feel it, that invisible weight pressing on my chest, suffocating me, the presence of someone else in my space, someone who shouldn't be there, someone who'd found a way inside. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but when the operator answered, I found myself speechless. What could I tell her? That someone had knocked on my door and whispered to me, that I'd found a doll in my yard, that my neighbor watched me. 911. What's your emergency? Someone's been. I stopped, realizing how ridiculous I would sound. Never mind. False alarm. I hung up before she could respond, feeling more isolated than ever. The next few weeks became a blur of escalating psychological warfare. Every night brought new torments, each more invasive than the last. Every morning revealed fresh evidence of his nocturnal visits. A child's shoe appeared on my doorstep, small, pink, with cartoon characters on the side. Where had he gotten it? Whose child had worn it? A broken picture frame containing a photo of a family I didn't recognize. Mother, father, 2 children, all smiling at the camera. But someone had scratched out their faces with something sharp, leaving only deep gouges in the photographic paper. Each item came with the same message, written in those same block letters, "Come out and play." The items weren't just random objects. They told a story, painted a picture of violence and loss that suggested things far worse than simple harassment. The shoe implied a missing child. The defaced family photo spoke of destroyed lives. Each gift was a promise, a preview of what he was capable of. I stopped sleeping through the night. Every sound, the house settling, a car passing on the street, the rustle of wind through trees sent adrenaline coursing through my system. I installed additional locks on all my doors and windows, but they felt inadequate against someone who seemed to move through the darkness like smoke. The sensation of being watched never let up. It was like living in a fishbowl, knowing that every movement was being catalogued and analyzed. I couldn't eat breakfast without feeling eyes on me through the kitchen window. I couldn't check my mail without scanning the street for his motionless figure. I couldn't sit on my own porch without the crawling certainty that I was being studied. Sleep became impossible. Even when exhaustion finally claimed me, my dreams were filled with tapping sounds and whispered invitations. I'd wake up convinced that someone had been in my room, that the shadows in the corners were wrong, that the air itself had been disturbed by an unwelcome presence. My work performance suffered. I found myself staring out my office window, wondering if he'd somehow followed me, wondering if he was watching me even there. Colleagues began to comment on my appearance, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I jumped at unexpected sounds, the constant checking and rechecking of my phone for messages that never came. I considered talking to Mrs. Patterson, but what could I tell her? That her new neighbor was playing psychological games? That he was leaving me presents and invitations? She'd think I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. The isolation was the worst part. The fear was driving me away from the very community connections I'd moved to Maple Street to find. I stopped attending the neighborhood barbecues, avoided conversations with other residents, turned down Mrs. Patterson's invitations for coffee. I was becoming exactly what he seemed to want: alone, vulnerable, cut off from any support system. It was like I was living in a constant state of terror, always waiting for the next shoe to drop. And then, One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag with trembling hands, throwing clothes and toiletries into a suitcase without any regard for organization. I had to get away, had to break whatever spell he'd cast over my life. Distance would give me perspective, maybe help me think clearly about what to do next. I stayed with my friend Marcus across town, sleeping on his couch and jumping at every unexpected sound. But even there, 40 miles from Maple Street, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being hunted. Marcus tried to be supportive, but I could see the concern in his eyes, the way he measured his words when talking to me. I was acting like a paranoid schizophrenic, seeing threats everywhere, unable to sleep or concentrate. "Maybe you should talk to someone," he suggested gently, after I'd spent the third night pacing his living room instead of sleeping. "A therapist, or maybe your doctor. This level of stress isn't healthy." But I knew what I'd experienced wasn't a product of mental illness. The doll, the notes, the late-night visits, they were real, documented, witnessed. One night, while I was lying on Marcus's couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of his neighborhood, the phone rang. It was 2:47 a.m., according to the cable box. Marcus's phone never rang this late unless it was an emergency. But Marcus didn't wake up. The phone rang and rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence like a knife. Finally, I answered it myself, hoping to stop the noise before it disturbed Marcus. "Hello?" My voice was trembling, barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, just as I was about to hang up, a deep, raspy voice replied, "Come out and play." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, my entire body shaking. He'd found me. Somehow, despite being in a different city, staying with someone he couldn't possibly know about, he'd tracked me down. How was that possible? How could he have gotten Marcus's number? How could he have known where I was? I couldn't take it anymore. The fear had followed me across town, had invaded what should have been a safe space, had demonstrated that distance was no protection against whatever game he was playing. Something in me snapped, and I realized I couldn't keep running forever. The next day, I drove back to Maple Street with a resolve that surprised me. I was tired of running, tired of jumping at shadows, tired of letting fear control every aspect of my life. If he wanted to play games, then we'd play games. But this time, I'd set the rules. I stood in front of his house for a long while, just looking up at those dark windows that had become the focal point of my nightmares. The yard was still bare dirt and dying grass, more desolate than ever. No sign of normal human habitation, no garden hose, no mailbox flag, no newspaper on the driveway. It was as if the house existed in a state of permanent abandonment, despite clear evidence of occupancy. And that's when I saw it. The faintest movement in one of the upstairs windows, just the outline of a figure standing still, watching me watch the house. But this time, I didn't feel that same crushing dread that had characterized our previous encounters. Instead, I felt empowered, resolved. This was my neighborhood too, my street, my life that he'd been trying to control. I wasn't going to let him win through intimidation and psychological manipulation. I marched up to his front door, my hands shaking, but my resolve firm. The same bare concrete steps, the same unmarked door that had never answered my previous attempts at communication. But this time would be different. I knocked hard and persistent, the kind of knocking that demanded acknowledgement. "I know you're in there," I called out, my voice carrying more confidence than I felt. "We need to talk." No answer. I knocked again, using the side of my fist this time, making enough noise to wake the entire neighborhood. I didn't care who heard me or what the other residents might think. Mrs. Patterson could witness this confrontation. Maybe she'd finally understand what I'd been dealing with. "I'm not leaving until you answer," I shouted. "You want to play games? Let's play." The door remained closed, but I could hear movement inside. Footsteps, the creak of floorboards, maybe the whisper of curtains being adjusted. He was there, listening, probably enjoying my frustration. That's when I noticed the doorknob. It was turned slightly, as if someone had unlocked it, but forgotten to actually secure the latch. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open, with a long, protesting creak that seemed to echo through the empty house beyond. I stood on the threshold for a moment, my heart pounding, suddenly aware that crossing this line would change everything. Breaking and entering, trespassing, these were crimes, regardless of the justification I felt. But after weeks of psychological torment, after being driven from my own home by fear, the legal niceties seemed irrelevant. "Hello," I called out as I stepped inside. "I'm coming in. We're going to settle this." The house was dark, cold, and completely empty. Not just undecorated, actually empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no sign that anyone had ever lived here. My footsteps echoed off bare walls and hardwood floors as I moved from room to room. The living room, empty. Kitchen, empty. Dining room, empty. It didn't smell like anything. No cooking odors, no personal scents, no trace of human habitation. It was like walking through a house that had been abandoned for months, maybe years. I climbed the stairs, each step producing a sharp creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The upstairs was the same. Empty bedrooms with bare walls and dirty windows. A bathroom with no toiletries, no shower curtain, no towels. No sign of the person who'd been watching me, leaving me gifts, making late-night phone calls. I searched every room twice, looking for hidden doors, secret closets, any explanation for how someone could live here without leaving any trace. I checked the basement, a concrete box containing nothing but a water heater and electrical panel. But I knew better. I knew someone had been here. The boxes I'd watched him carry inside that first day, the movements I'd seen in the windows, the presence I'd felt watching me for weeks, none of that had been imagination. As I stood in the center of the empty living room, trying to process what I was seeing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the hardwood floor, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were words carved with something sharp. "Come out and play. Come out and play. Come out and play." The phrase was repeated dozens of times, covering nearly the entire floor in shallow grooves that would be invisible to a casual observer but unmistakable once you noticed the pattern. Someone had spent hours, maybe days, carving those words into the floor. Someone had obsessed over that phrase, had turned it into a mantra, had literally inscribed it into the foundation of this house. I backed toward the door, my temporary courage evaporating in the face of evidence that suggested a level of mental illness far beyond simple harassment. This wasn't a prank or a boundary issue with an antisocial neighbor. This was the work of someone genuinely dangerous, someone who'd constructed an elaborate fantasy around me and was prepared to act on it. As I reached the front door, I heard something that stopped me cold. Footsteps on the front porch. Slow, deliberate footsteps. The same rhythm I'd heard circling my house during those terrifying nights. I was trapped. The back door was locked, and I'd have to pass the front windows to reach it anyway. Whoever was approaching would see me, would know I'd been inside. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front door. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door frame, trying to become invisible, barely breathing. Through the thin walls, I could hear him breathing, shifting his weight, waiting. The doorknob turned. Light spilled into the house as the door swung open. A shadow fell across the threshold, tall, broad-shouldered, exactly matching the silhouette I'd seen watching me from the windows. But when he stepped into the light, I saw his face for the first time. It was a face I recognized. Marcus, my friend Marcus, who'd let me stay on his couch, who'd suggested I see a therapist, who'd been so concerned about my mental health. Marcus, whose phone had rung at 2:47 a.m. with a call meant for me. Marcus, who somehow had access to an empty house next door to my new home. "Hello, David," he said calmly, as if we'd run into each other at the grocery store. "I've been waiting for you to come back." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. The timing of his helpfulness when I'd needed a place to stay. His concern about my mental state. His suggestions that I was paranoid, that I needed professional help. He'd been gaslighting me, manipulating my perceptions, making me doubt my own sanity, while simultaneously being the cause of my terror. "You," was all I could manage. "I wanted you to understand," he said, stepping further into the house but keeping between me and the door. "I wanted you to feel what it was like to be watched, to be hunted, to have someone invade your life and take control." "Why?" The word came out as a whisper. "Because you stole her," he said. And for the first time, his calm mask slipped, revealing something raw and furious beneath. "Sarah was mine first. We were together before you ever met her, and you took her away." Sarah, my ex-wife. I remembered now. She'd mentioned a Marcus from college, someone she'd dated briefly before we met, someone who'd had trouble accepting that their relationship was over. "She left you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "That wasn't my fault. She would have come back to me if you hadn't interfered, if you hadn't convinced her that I was unstable." I remembered now. Sarah had mentioned an ex-boyfriend who'd become obsessive, who'd followed her, who'd made her feel unsafe. She'd asked me to help her get a restraining order. "So you decided to make me feel the same way," I said. "I wanted you to understand what it felt like," he repeated, "to have someone always watching, always waiting, always just out of reach. I wanted you to know what you did to me." The empty house suddenly made sense. He'd rented it, probably using a fake name, just to torment me. The perfect staging ground for his psychological warfare. "The phone call," I said. "You called your own house." He smiled, an expression that chilled me more than his previous anger. "I had to make sure you understood that distance wouldn't help, that I could reach you anywhere." I looked around the empty house, at the words carved into the floor, at the man I'd trusted enough to sleep on his couch. "You're insane." "I'm focused," he corrected. "I've spent 2 years planning this, 2 years watching you, learning your habits, waiting for the right opportunity. When you moved to Maple Street, it was perfect. So isolated, so trusting, so easy to make you feel like you were losing your mind. The doll, the notes, the late-night visits. It had all been him, not a stranger, not a random psychopath, but someone I'd considered a friend, someone who'd comforted me through my divorce, who'd offered me shelter when I felt most vulnerable." "What do you want?" I asked. "I want you to disappear," he said simply. "Like you made me disappear from Sarah's life. I want you to understand that some people don't deserve happiness." I'm still not sure exactly what happened next. whether it was adrenaline or desperation, or simply the human survival instinct finally kicking in. But I moved faster than I thought possible. I rushed him, tackling him around the waist and driving him backward toward the door. We struggled, crashing into the door frame, both of us fighting for control. He was stronger than me, but I had the advantage of desperation. I broke free and ran, sprinting across his yard and mine, fumbling with my keys at my front door while he shouted behind me, "You can't hide forever, David. I know where you live. I know everything about you." I made it inside and immediately called 911, this time with a clear story to tell. Breaking and entering, stalking, harassment, threats. The police arrived within minutes, but when they went to his house, it was empty again. Marcus was gone, vanished, as completely as if he'd never existed. The police found evidence, the carved words in the floor, fingerprints on items he'd left in my yard, records of the house rental under a false name. They issued a warrant for his arrest, but he disappeared completely. That was 6 months ago. I still live on Maple Street, though I've installed a security system and changed all my locks. Mrs. Patterson brings me casseroles and checks on me regularly. The neighborhood has returned to its peaceful suburban rhythm. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself checking the windows. Sometimes I wake up convinced I've heard tapping at the glass. Sometimes I find myself wondering if that car parked across the street is the same one that was there yesterday. I'm still not sure whether he was real, or if I'd just let my mind run wild during those weeks of escalating fear. The police say he existed, that the evidence proves it, but sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I wonder if Marcus was just another manifestation of my own guilt and paranoia. Either way, I've learned something important. The most dangerous monsters are often the ones who know exactly how to make you doubt your own sanity. The ones who can turn your mind against itself, who can make you complicit in your own destruction. And sometimes, the scariest realization is that you never really know who's watching, who's waiting, who's planning to make you disappear. The invitation to come out and play might come from anyone, even someone you trust. It all started with something so simple, it didn't even seem like it would matter. I had just moved into a small suburban neighborhood, a place where everything felt peaceful, the kind of area where the streets were quiet and everyone knew everyone's name. People waved as they passed by. Kids rode their bikes in circles up and down the block, and the lawns looked like they'd been carefully manicured for years. The house I'd bought was a modest 2-story colonial with white shutters and a red front door. It had that lived-in feel that comes from decades of families making memories within its walls. The previous owners had left behind a few things: a rusty wind chime on the back porch, some perennial flowers that were just starting to bloom in the spring air, and a general sense of warmth that made me feel like I'd made the right choice. I was still getting used to the routine, unpacking boxes, and figuring out where I wanted everything to go in my new house. When I first saw him, he lived next door. Mr. Peterson, or Pete, as he insisted I call him, when he introduced himself that first weekend. He wasn't exactly the kind of neighbor you'd imagine in a place like this. Pete was probably in his late 50s, always wearing old flannel shirts and jeans that looked like they'd been patched up one too many times. His hair was thinning and greasy, combed over in a way that fooled no one. But it was his eyes that struck me most. They were deep-set and dark, and he didn't blink much. He just kind of stared at everything with an intensity that made conversations feel longer than they actually were. That first meeting happened on a Saturday morning. I was dragging boxes from my car to the front porch when he appeared at the property line between our houses. He didn't call out a greeting or wave. He just stood there, watching me struggle with a particularly heavy box labeled kitchen stuff in my hasty handwriting. "You need help with that?" he finally asked, his voice carrying a slight rasp like he'd been a smoker for years. "Oh, no thanks," I replied, setting the box down for a moment to catch my breath. "I've got it handled." He nodded slowly, but didn't move. "Name's Pete Peterson. Live right there." He pointed to the house I already knew was his, a brown ranch-style home that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The lawn was neat enough, but everything else had a worn, tired quality to it. "Nice to meet you, Pete. I'm Sarah." I wiped my sweaty palm on my jeans before extending it for a handshake. His grip was firm, almost uncomfortably so, and he held on just a beat too long. "Sarah," he repeated, like he was testing how my name felt in his mouth. "Pretty name. You moving in alone?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't necessarily inappropriate. Neighbors often asked about family situations, but something about the way he asked it, with that unwavering stare, made me uncomfortable. "Yeah, just me," I answered, immediately regretting the honesty. "Well, I should get back to unpacking. Lots to do." Sure," he said, but still didn't move. "You let me know if you need anything. Anything at all. I'm always around." There was something about the way he said "always around" that stuck with me as I hauled the box inside. Maybe it was the emphasis he put on it, or maybe it was just the general oddness of the interaction. But I found myself glancing out the window to see if he was still standing there. He wasn't, but I had the strangest feeling he was still watching from somewhere. For the next few days, I threw myself into the process of making the house feel like home. I hung pictures, arranged furniture, and tried to establish routines. The neighborhood during daylight hours was exactly what I'd hoped for when I decided to leave city life behind. Children played in yards while their parents worked in gardens or washed cars. Dog walkers strolled by at regular intervals. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and borrowed cups of sugar from each other. But even during those first normal days, I kept noticing Pete, not in any dramatic way, just small observations that accumulated like dust. He seemed to spend a lot of time in his front yard, tinkering with an old blue sedan that looked like it hadn't run in years. Sometimes he'd be under the hood, tools spread around him on a greasy tarp. Other times he'd just be standing next to it, staring off into space with that same intense expression I'd noticed during our first meeting. What struck me as odd was that I never saw him actually working on the car. He'd have the hood up and tools out, sure, but mostly he just stood there. And more often than not, when I happened to glance out my window, his attention seemed to be focused in the direction of my house rather than whatever automotive project he was supposedly pursuing. I told myself I was being paranoid. Every neighborhood had that one guy, right? The quiet, mysterious type who kept to himself and had his own way of doing things. Pete was probably just one of those people who liked to take their time with projects, who found the act of standing and thinking as important as the actual work. I was overthinking it because everything was still new and unfamiliar. The first week passed without any real incidents. I waved when I saw Pete outside, and he'd nod back with what might have been a smile. It was hard to tell with his weathered face. I started to relax, to feel like maybe my initial unease had been nothing more than new place jitters. But on Thursday of that first week, something happened that should have been my first real warning. I was in my kitchen around dinner time, standing at the sink washing dishes while listening to a podcast through my phone speaker. The window above the sink looked directly across the side yard toward Pete's house. giving me a clear view of his driveway and part of his backyard. I wasn't paying much attention to what was outside. I was focused on the conversation in my earbuds about serial killers in small towns, which in retrospect seems like an unfortunate coincidence. When I looked up to rinse a plate, Pete was there, not in his driveway or working on his car, but standing at the edge of his property, maybe 20 feet from my kitchen window, facing my house, facing me. He was completely still, hands at his sides, just watching me through the glass. Our eyes met, and I felt a jolt of surprise that made me drop the plate back into the soapy water with a splash. For a moment, neither of us moved. He didn't wave or look embarrassed at being caught staring. He just continued to watch me with that same intense focus, like I was a television program he was particularly interested in. I raised my hand in what I hoped was a casual neighborly wave, trying to dispel the awkwardness of the moment. Pete lifted his hand slowly in response, but the gesture felt more like an acknowledgement than a greeting. Then, without any change in expression, he turned and walked back toward his house, disappearing around the corner. I stood there for several minutes, hands still submerged in dishwater, trying to process what had just happened. People look out their windows all the time, I told myself. Neighbors notice each other's comings and goings. It's normal. But the memory of his unwavering stare, the way he'd been standing so deliberately in a spot where he could see into my kitchen, felt anything but normal. That night, I made sure all my curtains were closed before I went to bed. The weekend brought my first real taste of how different Pete's behavior was from that of a typical neighbor. On Saturday morning, I decided to tackle some yard work, trimming hedges, pulling weeds, generally trying to make my new property look like I cared about it. It was one of those perfect spring days, warm but not hot, with a light breeze that made outdoor work actually pleasant. I'd been outside for maybe an hour when I became aware of a presence. You know that feeling when you're being watched? That prickly sensation between your shoulder blades that makes you want to turn around. I tried to ignore it at first, focusing on the stubborn dandelions that had taken over a section of the front flower bed, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger until I couldn't concentrate on anything else. When I finally looked up, Pete was on his front porch, not sitting in a chair or engaged in any activity that would explain his presence there, just standing at the railing, coffee mug in hand, watching me work. The distance between our houses was maybe 30 yards, close enough for me to see his face clearly. He wasn't even pretending to be doing something else. His full attention was directed at me. "Morning, Pete," I called out, trying to inject some normalcy into what felt like an increasingly abnormal situation. He raised his coffee mug slightly, in what I took to be a greeting, but didn't respond verbally, just continued watching. I went back to weeding, but the spell of the peaceful morning was broken. Every few minutes, I'd glance up to find him still there, still watching. When I moved to a different section of the garden, his position on the porch shifted slightly to maintain his line of sight. When I went around to the backyard to work on the overgrown area near my back door, I caught glimpses of him through the gaps in the fence that separated our properties. This went on for the entire 3 hours I spent outside. Every time I checked, there he was, standing, watching, occasionally taking a sip from his mug, but never moving away or finding something else to occupy his attention. By the time I finally gave up and went inside, my nerves were frayed and my hands were shaking slightly as I locked the back door behind me. Sunday was worse. I had planned a quiet day of unpacking the last few boxes and maybe reading on the back porch. But when I carried my coffee outside around 9 in the morning, planning to enjoy the sunshine and the privacy of my fenced backyard, I discovered that Pete had apparently been waiting for me. His head appeared over the fence almost immediately. The fence between our properties was about 6 feet tall, high enough to provide privacy for normal activities, but not high enough to prevent someone from looking over if they really wanted to. And Pete clearly wanted to. "Beautiful morning," he said, his voice carrying easily across the small distance. "Yes, it is," I agreed, settling into one of the wicker chairs I'd arranged near a small table. I opened my book, hoping the gesture would signal that I was looking forward to some quiet time.
What you reading?
I held up the cover. A mystery novel I'd been looking forward to starting. Just some light reading. He nodded like this was fascinating information. I like mysteries too, always trying to figure out what people are thinking, what they're planning to do next. There was something in the way he said it that made me look up sharply. But his expression was neutral. "This one's supposed to be really good," I said, hoping to end the conversation. "Mind if I ask you something, Sarah?" The use of my name, which he seemed to deploy strategically, always made me slightly uncomfortable. "Sure. You ever get lonely? Living alone in a big house like that?" The question was inappropriate in about 5 different ways, but I tried to handle it diplomatically. I like the peace and quiet, actually. It's one of the reasons I moved here. "Peace and quiet," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yeah, this is a real peaceful neighborhood. Safe, too. Nothing bad ever happens here. Of course, that means we all look out for each other, you know? Keep an eye on things." "That's nice," I managed. "Yep, I'm usually up pretty late myself. So if you ever need anything, or if anything seems strange, you just let me know. I'm always paying attention." Always paying attention. The phrase echoed in my head long after he finally disappeared back into his own yard. I tried to return to my book, but concentration was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every small sound from the direction of his property made me tense up. After about 20 minutes, I gave up and went inside. The pattern continued throughout the following week. If I was in my front yard, Pete would find a reason to be in his. If I was visible through a window, he'd position himself where he could see me clearly. If I came home from work or errands, he'd emerge from his house within minutes, always with some plausible excuse, checking his mailbox, getting something from his car, working on that mysterious automotive project that never seemed to progress. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental. It was like he was monitoring my movements, learning my schedule. When I left for work at 7:45 each morning, he'd be outside. When I returned around 6 p.m., there he was. If I went out for a run in the evening, I'd see him in his front window as I passed by. I started varying my routines, leaving at different times, taking different routes through the neighborhood. But somehow, Pete always seemed to know when I was around. If I tried to sneak out quietly through my back door to avoid his attention, I'd still catch glimpses of him through windows or from behind trees in his yard. The nights were the worst part. It started with small sounds that could have been anything. Branches scraping against the house, cats fighting in the alley, the normal settling noises of an old building. But these sounds had a rhythmic quality that seemed too deliberate to be random. Soft shuffling footsteps in the gravel driveway, the creak of wooden porch steps, the whisper of bushes being brushed against. I'd lie in bed, straining to listen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away to whoever might be out there. Sometimes I'd work up the courage to get up and look out the window, but I never saw anything definitive, just shadows that might have been moving, shapes that could have been a person or could have been a tree swaying in the wind. One night, around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like someone trying the handle of my back door, the soft click of metal against metal, followed by the barely audible squeak of the door being tested against its frame. I lay frozen in bed, phone in my hand, thumb hovering over the 911 call button, but the sound stopped after a few seconds, and when I finally got up to check, the door was still locked, still secure, no signs of tampering. I was starting to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe the stress of moving, starting a new job, adjusting to a different environment was making me paranoid. Maybe Pete was just a harmless eccentric who didn't understand normal social boundaries. Maybe the nighttime sounds were exactly what they seemed, random urban noises that my anxious brain was transforming into something sinister. But then Friday afternoon happened, and all my attempts at rational explanation crumbled. I came home from work to find a small gift on my front porch, a potted plant. Nothing expensive or elaborate, just a small flowering begonia in a plain terracotta pot. There was a note attached. "Welcome to the neighborhood. Hope you're settling in well. Your neighbor Pete." The gesture should have been sweet. Neighbors bringing welcome gifts was exactly the kind of thing I'd hoped for when I moved to a suburban community. But something about it felt wrong. The plant had been placed precisely in the center of my doormat, like it had been carefully positioned. The note was written in cramped, almost childish handwriting, and the paper looked like it had been torn from a larger sheet. But what really bothered me was the timing. I'd been coming home at roughly the same time all week, usually around 6 p.m. Today, I'd stayed late at work to finish a project and didn't get home until almost 8:30. The plant was still there, which meant either Pete had left it much earlier and it had sat unnoticed all day, unlikely, since I always checked my front step when I got home. I brought the plant inside and set it on my kitchen windowsill, the same window where Pete had watched me doing dishes that first week. As I was adjusting its position to get the best light, I looked out toward his house and saw him in his front window, watching me with what looked like satisfaction. When our eyes met, he smiled and gave me a thumbs up. That night, I didn't just close my curtains. I went around the house and checked every lock, every window latch, every possible point of entry. I dragged a kitchen chair over to prop against the back door, even though the deadbolt was already engaged, and for the first time since moving in, I slept with my phone on the pillow next to my head, ready to call for help at the first sign of trouble. The breaking point came the following Tuesday. I'd been living in the house for almost 3 weeks, and Pete's behavior had settled into a pattern that was both predictable and deeply unsettling. Every morning, every evening, every weekend, the same routine of watching and waiting. I'd started parking in my garage instead of the driveway, using my back door instead of the front, keeping my blinds closed even during the day. I was essentially living like a prisoner in my own home. But Pete seemed to interpret my attempts at privacy as some kind of game. The more I tried to avoid him, the more creative he became in his surveillance. I'd see him in second-story windows I hadn't noticed before. I'd catch glimpses of him in his backyard when I thought I was hidden in mine. He'd started leaving small items on my porch, not just plants, but things like a magazine about home security. "Thought you might find this interesting. A flashlight, good to have reliable lighting, and once, a small hand mirror with no note attached at all." Each gift felt like a message, though I couldn't decode what he was trying to tell me. The mirror was the worst. I kept imagining him watching me look at my own reflection, studying my reactions to his increasingly bizarre behavior. I'd been debating whether to call the police. But what would I tell them? That my neighbor looked at me too much? That he left gifts on my porch? That I heard sounds at night that might or might not have been him? None of it added up to anything illegal, and I was afraid they'd dismiss me as a paranoid woman who couldn't handle living alone. Then on Tuesday evening, Pete solved my dilemma by escalating to something that crossed every line of appropriate neighbor behavior. I was in my living room, grading papers, I taught 5th grade at the local elementary school when I heard a knock at my front door. Not the doorbell, a slow, deliberate knocking that seemed designed to get attention without seeming urgent. I looked through the peephole and saw Pete standing on my porch, holding what looked like a bottle of wine. My first instinct was to ignore him, to pretend I wasn't home, but his knocking continued, patient and persistent, and I realized he probably knew I was there. My car was in the garage. Lights were on throughout the house, and the television was playing loudly enough to be audible from outside. "Sarah?" he called through the door. "I brought something for you. A little housewarming gift." I stood frozen for several minutes, hoping he'd give up and leave, but Pete seemed prepared to wait indefinitely. Finally, against every instinct, screaming at me to stay inside, I opened the door, keeping the chain latch engaged so it would only open a few inches. "Hi, Pete. What's up?" He held up the wine bottle, a cheap red with a label I didn't recognize. "Thought you might like this. It's a nice vintage. Well, not really vintage, but it's good wine." "That's very thoughtful, but you really didn't need to." "Why don't you invite me in?" he interrupted. "We could open it together, get to know each other better." The suggestion sent a chill down my spine. "I'm actually pretty busy tonight. Rain check." He tilted his head slightly, studying my face through the narrow gap allowed by the door chain. "Busy with what?" The question was so inappropriate that I almost laughed. "Just work stuff. You know how it is." "I could help," he offered. "I'm good with paperwork. Used to do bookkeeping for a few businesses in town." "I really appreciate the offer, but come on, Sarah. We're neighbors. We should be friends." His voice had taken on a slightly plaintive quality, like a child being denied something he wanted. "I've been trying to be nice, bringing you gifts, making sure you feel welcome. The least you could do is invite me in for a drink." The sense of entitlement in his tone made my stomach clench. "Pete, I'm sorry, but tonight really isn't good for me. Maybe some other time." I started to close the door, but he stepped forward, placing his hand against it to prevent it from shutting completely. Not aggressively, but firmly enough to make his point. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a conversational level that somehow felt more threatening than if he'd been shouting, "It's not safe for a woman to live alone, especially someone new to the area. You don't know who you can trust yet." "I'm fine. Thanks. I can take care of myself." "I'm sure you can. But still, if something happened, if someone tried to break in, or if you had an emergency, it would be good to know you had someone nearby who cared about your well-being, someone who was paying attention." There was that phrase again. Paying attention. He seemed to use it deliberately, like it held special meaning that I was supposed to understand. "Well, I better let you go," I said, trying to inject finality into my voice. "Thanks for the wine." He held my gaze for a long moment before stepping back and allowing me to close the door. I immediately engaged the deadbolt and leaned against the door, my heart hammering in my chest. Through the peephole, I watched him walk slowly back to his own house. But instead of going inside, he turned and looked directly back at my front door, as if he knew I was watching. He stood there for several minutes, just staring at my house, before finally disappearing inside his own. I spent the rest of the evening in a state of agitated anxiety. The wine bottle sat on my kitchen counter where I'd dropped it after locking the door, and I found myself glancing at it periodically, like it might suddenly reveal Pete's true intentions. Should I keep it? Throw it away? Return it? Every option felt fraught with potential consequences. Around 10 p.m., I decided I needed to talk to someone about what was happening. I called my sister Jenny, who lived about an hour away in the city I'd moved from. She'd been skeptical about my decision to relocate to a small town, warning me about the potential weirdness of suburban life. "He sounds like a creep," she said bluntly, after I'd recounted the evening's events, along with the previous weeks of escalating behavior. "Why haven't you called the police?" "And told them what? That my neighbor talks to me and brings me gifts?" "Sarah, normal neighbors don't stand outside staring at your house for hours. Normal neighbors don't show up at your door demanding to be invited in. This guy is stalking you." Hearing her say it out loud, stalking, made something click into place. That's exactly what Pete's behavior amounted to. He was systematically monitoring my activities, learning my routines, and pushing boundaries to see how much I'd tolerate. "What should I do?" I asked. "Document everything. Keep a log of when you see him, what he does, what he says. If it escalates, you'll need evidence, and maybe talk to some of your other neighbors. See if they've noticed anything strange about this guy." The conversation with Jenny helped clarify my thinking, but it also ramped up my anxiety to a new level. If Pete really was stalking me, then every day I spent trying to handle it politely was a day that allowed his behavior to become more entrenched, more dangerous. That night, I started a written log in a small notebook, documenting everything I could remember from the past 3 weeks, along with the details of the evening's encounter. Reading back over what I'd written, the pattern was even more disturbing than I'd realized. Pete's behavior had been escalating steadily and systematically, from passive observation to active engagement to outright boundary violation. I was going to have to do something about it. The question was, what and how quickly, and whether I could manage it before Pete decided to escalate even further. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard the familiar shuffling sounds outside my house, but this time, instead of lying in bed wondering if I was imagining things, I crept to my bedroom window and carefully moved the curtain aside just enough to see out. Pete was there, standing in my side yard, about 10 feet from the house, looking up at my bedroom window. When he saw the curtain move, he didn't try to hide or pretend he was doing something else. He just stood there, watching me watch him. After several seconds, he raised his hand in that same slow, deliberate wave I'd come to dread. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of his own property. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, with my phone in my hand and my bedroom door locked, listening for any sound that might indicate he'd decided to come back. The next few days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Pete seemed to understand that he'd crossed a line with his uninvited appearance at my door, and he pulled back just enough to avoid giving me any clear reason to call the police. No more unexpected visits, no more gifts left on my porch. But the watching continued, more intense than ever. He'd position himself in spots where he could observe me, but maintain plausible deniability if confronted. Checking his mailbox when I left for work, watering plants in his front yard when I returned home, standing at his kitchen sink, which faced my driveway, whenever I pulled in or out of my garage. Each time our eyes met, he'd nod or wave with an expression of such calculated innocence that I almost wondered if I was losing my mind. I started documenting everything in my notebook, just as Jenny had suggested. Times, locations, specific behaviors. The pattern that emerged was even more systematic than I'd realized. Pete's surveillance of my activities was comprehensive and carefully planned. He knew my schedule down to 15-minute intervals. He'd figured out which rooms I used at what times of day. He'd learned to predict my movements with disturbing accuracy. Friday afternoon, I decided to test my theory. Instead of coming straight home from work, I drove to a coffee shop downtown and sat there for 2 hours, grading papers and watching the street through the window. At exactly 6:15 p.m., my usual arrival time, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hope everything's okay. Noticed you're running late today. Pete." I stared at the message, my hands starting to shake. How had he gotten my number? And more importantly, how had he known I was late, unless he'd been monitoring my arrival time every single day for weeks? I called the police. Officer Martinez was probably in her mid-30s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She arrived at my house about an hour after I called, and I showed her my notebook, explained the escalating pattern of behavior, and gave her Pete's text message as evidence. "Has he threatened you directly?" she asked, flipping through my documentation. "Not in so many words, but showing up at my door demanding to be invited in, sending text messages to a number I never gave him. That feels threatening to me." She nodded. "I understand, and you're right to be concerned. The problem is that most of what you've described falls into a gray area legally. Standing in his own yard, even if he's watching you, isn't a crime. Bringing gifts to a neighbor isn't harassment, even if it feels invasive. The text message is more concerning, especially since you didn't give him your number. So what can you do?" "I'll go talk to him. Let him know we've received a complaint about his behavior, and that he needs to respect your privacy and personal space. Sometimes that's enough to solve the problem. People don't realize how their actions are being perceived, and a visit from the police helps clarify things. And if it doesn't solve the problem, then you call me immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to handle it yourself, any escalation at all, and we'll pursue more formal charges." Officer Martinez spent about 20 minutes at Pete's house. I watched from my living room window as she stood on his porch, talking and occasionally gesturing in the direction of my house. Pete's body language was respectful, nodding, hands visible, no aggressive postures. To any casual observer, it would have looked like a perfectly normal conversation between a citizen and a police officer. When she came back to my house, she looked cautiously optimistic. "He says he was just trying to be a good neighbor, that he didn't realize his behavior was making you uncomfortable. Claims he got your phone number from a neighborhood directory that was left at his house by the previous homeowner. He apologized for overstepping and promised to give you space. Do you believe him?" Officer Martinez paused. He said all the right things, but there was something, I can't put my finger on it. Just keep documenting everything, and don't hesitate to call if anything else happens. For the rest of that evening and all day Saturday, it seemed like the police visit might have worked. I didn't see Pete outside when I left for errands. He wasn't visible in any of his windows when I worked in my yard. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could move around my own property without being watched. Sunday evening shattered that illusion completely. I'd spent the day cleaning house and catching up on personal projects, enjoying the novelty of not feeling observed in my own home. Around 9 p.m., I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my living room with a book, feeling more relaxed than I had since moving in. The house was quiet, except for the usual settling sounds and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I was deep into my novel when I heard it, a soft scratching at the front window, like tree branches scraping against glass. But there were no trees close enough to my front window to make that sound. I set down my book and listened. The scratching came again, deliberate and rhythmic. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. My mouth went dry. I crept to the front window and carefully moved the curtain aside to look out. The porch light was on, casting a circle of yellow illumination, but I didn't see anything unusual, just the empty street, Pete's dark house across the way, and the ordinary shadows of a suburban evening. The scratching stopped. I went back to my book, but couldn't concentrate. Every small sound seemed amplified, loaded with potential threat. When I heard a similar noise at the back of the house, coming from the direction of my bedroom window, I knew it wasn't branches or cats or any other innocent explanation. Pete was out there. I turned off the lights in the living room and made my way carefully to my bedroom, staying low and avoiding the windows. The scratching at the back window was more pronounced, definitely deliberate. Someone was using something, a coin, a key, maybe a small tool, to scrape against the glass in a pattern designed to get attention without being loud enough to alert the neighbors. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. But before I could hit send, the scratching stopped. I waited, hardly breathing, for several minutes. Nothing. Maybe he'd left. Maybe I'd scared him off somehow. Then I heard footsteps on the gravel path that ran along the side of my house. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause at each window. He was making a circuit of the house, checking every possible point of entry, testing my reactions. I crawled to my bedroom window and positioned myself where I could see out without being visible from outside. Pete was there, standing just outside my bedroom window in the dark. He was close enough that I could make out his features in the faint light from the street lamp. He wasn't trying to hide or sneak around. He was just standing there, looking directly at the window where I was crouched, waiting. Our eyes met through the glass, and my heart nearly stopped. He knew I was watching him, had probably known all along. This wasn't about breaking in or stealing anything. This was about power, about demonstrating that he could come and go as he pleased, that my home wasn't the sanctuary I thought it was. For several seconds, we just stared at each other. Then Pete raised his hand to the glass and tapped gently, the way you might knock on a friend's door. The sound was soft, almost polite, but it hit me like a physical blow. "I see you," he whispered, his voice barely audible through the window, but perfectly clear in the still night air. I scrambled for my phone and hit 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the device. 911. "What's your emergency?" "There's someone outside my house," I whispered, afraid to speak louder in case Pete could hear me. "He's looking in my bedroom window. I need help." "Ma'am, I need you to speak up. Can you tell me your address?" I gave the operator my address and explained the situation as quickly and quietly as possible. She assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line. But by the time the police arrived, maybe 5 minutes later, Pete was gone. Officer Martinez was one of the responding officers, along with a male colleague whose name I didn't catch. They searched the property thoroughly, checking for footprints in the flower beds under my windows, looking for any physical evidence of Pete's presence. They found disturbed soil under my bedroom window and what looked like scratches on the glass, but nothing that definitively proved who had made them. "Did you see which direction he went?" Officer Martinez asked. "No. I was too scared to keep watching after he spoke to me." "He spoke to you. What did he say?" "I see you." He tapped on the window and whispered, "I see you." The officers exchanged a look that told me this had moved beyond the realm of neighborly misunderstandings. "We're gonna go talk to Mr. Peterson," the male officer said. "See if he has an alibi for this evening." They were gone for about half an hour. When they returned, their expressions were grim. "He claims he was inside all evening, watching television, says he has no idea what you're talking about, and suggests you might be having stress-related hallucinations because of the recent move." "Hallucinations?" I felt a surge of anger. "There are scratches on my window." "We know," Officer Martinez said, "and we believe you. The problem is that we can't prove he made them. But this is definitely escalating beyond anything we can ignore. I'm going to file a report recommending that the district attorney consider stalking charges. In the meantime, I want you to document everything, and I mean everything. If he so much as looks at you wrong, you call us immediately." After the police left, I sat in my living room with all the lights on, too wired to sleep. The house felt different now, violated, unsafe. Pete had demonstrated that he could come right up to my windows whenever he wanted, could watch me sleep, could whisper threats through the glass. The fact that he'd disappeared before the police arrived only proved how carefully he'd planned the whole thing. I called Jenny and told her what had happened. "Pack a bag and come stay with me," she said immediately. "This is way beyond creepy neighbor territory. This guy is dangerous. I can't just abandon my house. If I leave, he wins." "Sarah, listen to yourself. This isn't about winning or losing. This is about staying safe. Come stay with me until the police figure out how to handle this guy." I knew she was right, but the idea of fleeing my own home felt like admitting defeat. I'd worked so hard to build a new life in this place, had invested everything I had in making it work. Running away would mean starting over again, and I wasn't sure I had the energy for another complete life change. But as I sat there in my brightly lit living room, checking and rechecking the locks on my doors, I realized that I was already living like a refugee in my own home. Pete had already won. The question now was what he planned to do with his victory. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound, the house settling, the wind in the trees, the distant hum of traffic, seemed potentially threatening. I sat in my living room with my phone in my hand, all the lights on, watching the windows for any sign of movement outside. Around 3 a.m., exhaustion finally overtook adrenaline, and I dozed fitfully in my chair until dawn. Monday morning brought a call from Officer Martinez with unexpected news. "We ran a background check on your neighbor," she said without preamble. "Peter Samuel Peterson has a history." My stomach clenched. What kind of history? 2 previous stalking complaints in other states. One in Oregon about 8 years ago. Another in Nevada 3 years ago. Both cases involved single women living alone. Both complaints were dropped when the women moved away. "Moved away," I repeated. "You mean he drove them out of their homes?" "That's what it looks like." Neither case went to trial, so he was never officially convicted of anything. But the pattern is clear. He targets women, escalates his behavior until they feel unsafe, then moves on to a new location when they leave. The information should have been validating, proof that I wasn't imagining things, that Pete really was as dangerous as I'd feared. Instead, it filled me with a cold dread. If Pete had done this before, if he had a system that worked, then he wasn't going to be discouraged by police visits or warnings. He was going to keep escalating until I either left or something terrible happened. "What are my options?" I asked. "We're building a case for stalking charges, but it takes time. The district attorney wants more evidence before moving forward. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you consider staying somewhere else for a few days." I thought about Jenny's offer, about the guest room in her apartment that was always available, but I also thought about Pete moving on to target another woman in another town, the cycle continuing indefinitely because no one had ever stood up to him long enough to make it stop. "What if I don't leave?" I asked. "What if I stay and help you gather that evidence?" Officer Martinez was quiet for a long moment. "I can't officially recommend that. It could be dangerous, but it might also be the only way to stop him. Sarah, this guy isn't going to just give up and move away. If you stay, He's going to keep pushing boundaries until something bad happens. Then maybe it's time something bad happened to him, instead of to his victims. That afternoon, I called in sick to work and drove to the city to have lunch with Jenny. She was horrified when I told her about Pete's history, and even more horrified when I explained my plan to stay and help build a case against him. "You're going to get yourself killed," she said bluntly. "This isn't your responsibility, Sarah. Let the police handle it." "The police can't handle it without evidence. And they can't get evidence if I'm not there to document what he does. So you're going to use yourself as bait." When she put it that way, the plan sounded less heroic and more foolish. But the alternative was abandoning my home and leaving Pete free to target the next woman who moved into the neighborhood. "I'm going to be careful," I said. "I'll have my phone with me at all times. I'll stay in contact with the police. If things get too dangerous, I'll leave." Jenny looked like she wanted to argue further, but she must have recognized the determination in my voice. Instead, she made me promise to call her every day and to come stay with her the moment I felt truly unsafe. That evening, I prepared my house like I was setting up a fortress. I checked every lock, tested every window latch, and positioned chairs and other furniture to block the most vulnerable entry points. I charged backup batteries for my phone and set up a camera app that would automatically upload videos to the cloud if I activated it. Most importantly, I stopped trying to avoid Pete. If he wanted to watch me, I was going to give him something to see. The change in my behavior caught his attention immediately. Tuesday evening, instead of staying inside with my curtains drawn, I sat on my front porch with a book, deliberately making myself visible and accessible. Pete appeared in his front yard within minutes, pretending to work on his eternally broken car while stealing glances in my direction. I waved cheerfully, as if Sunday night had never happened. He froze, apparently caught off guard by my friendliness. After a moment's hesitation, he waved back and started walking toward the property line between our houses. "Beautiful evening," he called out. "It really is," I agreed, my heart hammering, but my voice steady. I started the recording app on my phone, holding it casually in my lap where it would capture both audio and video of our interaction. Pete stopped at the edge of his driveway, close enough for conversation, but still technically on his own property. "You seem to be feeling better. I was worried about you after all that commotion the other night." "Commotion?" "All those police cars. Hope everything worked out okay." He was fishing, trying to find out what I'd told the police and how they'd responded. I decided to give him enough rope to hang himself. "Oh, that. Just a misunderstanding. I thought I heard someone outside my window, but it turned out to be nothing. You know how it is when you're living alone. Every little sound seems scary." Pete's eyes lit up with what looked like satisfaction. Living alone can be dangerous. You never know who might be watching, who might have bad intentions. "I suppose, but I feel pretty safe in this neighborhood. Everyone seems so friendly and normal." "Normal," he repeated, like the word tasted strange in his mouth. "Yes, I suppose we all seem normal during the day. It's nighttime when people's true nature comes out." The comment was so loaded with menace that I felt my skin crawl, but I kept my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "Just that people are different when they think no one is watching. They do things they'd never do in broad daylight. They become more honest about what they really want." "That's an interesting way to look at it." Pete stepped closer, moving from his driveway onto the grass strip that separated our properties. Technically still not on my land, but the symbolic boundary crossing was clear. "You know what I think, Sarah? I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. I think you've been watching me just as much as I've been watching you. My mouth went dry, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact. I'm not sure what you mean. Don't you? All those times you've looked out your window when I'm in my yard. All those little waves and smiles. You're curious about me, aren't you? You want to know what I'm really like. He was rewriting history, transforming his stalking behavior into some kind of mutual flirtation. The delusion was so complete, so disconnected from reality, that I realized Pete was probably much sicker than I'd initially understood. Pete, I think you might be misinterpreting. Am I? He took another step closer, now definitely on my property. Sunday night, when I came to visit you, you were watching for me. You knew I was there before I even got to your window. You came to my window? I kept my voice level, but my finger was poised over the phone's emergency call button. Don't pretend you don't remember. You were waiting for me. When I tapped on the glass and spoke to you, you looked right at me. You saw me. Pete, I think you should go back to your house now. Why? We're just talking. Neighbors getting to know each other better. He smiled, and for the first time, the expression looked genuinely warm, instead of calculated. It was somehow more frightening than his previous cold stares. I told you I could see you, he continued, moving closer to my porch. And you saw me too. That means something, Sarah. That's a connection. Please step back. You don't really want me to step back. If you did, you wouldn't be sitting out here where I could see you. You wouldn't have waved at me. You want this conversation just as much as I do. Pete was now at the bottom of my porch steps, looking up at me with that same intense focus that had made me uncomfortable from our first meeting. But this time, there was something else in his expression, a sense of ownership, like he'd finally claimed something he'd been working toward for weeks. You know what I think, he said, starting up the steps toward me. I think you've been playing hard to get this whole time, acting scared, calling the police, pretending you don't want me around. But deep down, you know we belong together. You know I'm the only one who really sees you. I should have known something was wrong when the landlord wouldn't meet me in person. The Craigslist ad had been too good to be true. A fully furnished Victorian house in the suburbs for half the market rate, available immediately. After 3 months of living in my car and crashing on friends' couches following my divorce, I wasn't in a position to be picky. The photos showed a charming 2-story home with original hardwood floors, ornate moldings, and a wraparound porch that looked like something from a magazine. The previous tenant left suddenly, Mr. Garrett had explained over the phone, his voice crackling through what sounded like a poor connection. Family emergency. Left everything behind. I just need someone reliable to take care of the place. When I asked about viewing the property, he'd insisted on leaving the keys under a loose brick by the front steps. I'm out of state dealing with my mother's estate, he'd said. Just take a look, and if you want it, we can handle the paperwork remotely. Red flags, I know, but desperation makes you stupid. The house sat at the end of Millfield Drive, separated from its neighbors by overgrown hedges that hadn't been trimmed in years. As I pulled into the gravel driveway that October afternoon, dead leaves crunching under my tires, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. The Victorian loomed before me, its dark windows like hollow eyes watching my approach. I found the key exactly where Mr. Garrett had said it would be, hidden under a brick that was so loose I nearly dropped it, trying to lift it. The front door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire house. The interior was exactly as the photos had shown, but somehow different in a way I couldn't quite place. The furniture was all there, a leather sofa in the living room, a mahogany dining table, Built-in bookshelves lined with volumes I didn't recognize. Everything was clean, almost pristine, as if the previous tenant had vanished mid-activity without disturbing a single dust mote. But it was the silence that unsettled me most. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty house, but something heavier, more oppressive. The kind of silence that makes you want to whisper, as if speaking too loudly might wake something better left sleeping. I walked through each room methodically, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood despite my efforts to move quietly. The kitchen was spacious and well-appointed, with cast iron pans still hanging from hooks above the stove. Upstairs, the master bedroom contained a 4-poster bed that looked like it belonged in a museum, complete with heavy velvet curtains that blocked most of the afternoon light. It was in the second bedroom that I found the first sign something might be amiss. The room was completely empty, except for a single chair positioned in the center, facing the window that looked out over the backyard. There was nothing particularly strange about it, just a simple wooden chair, but something about its placement seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if someone had been sitting there for hours, watching, waiting. I shook off the feeling and continued my tour. The basement was unfinished but dry, with stone walls that looked original to the house. A modern furnace hummed in one corner, and shelves lined the walls, mostly empty except for some paint cans and cleaning supplies, normal basement things. By the time I'd completed my walkthrough, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the windows. The house felt different in the growing darkness, smaller somehow, more intimate. I could almost imagine living here, spreading my belongings through these rooms, making it home. I called Mr. Garrett from the front porch. "I'll take it," I said without preamble. "Excellent," he replied, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "I'll email you the lease tonight. First month's rent and security deposit, and you can move in immediately. What about references? Credit check?" "Don't worry about all that," he said quickly. "I'm a good judge of character. Just send me the money via electronic transfer, and the house is yours." Another red flag. But I was beyond caring. I had a roof over my head, and that was all that mattered. That night, I returned to my friend Jake's apartment, where I'd been crashing, and packed my meager belongings. Everything I owned fit into 4 boxes and 2 suitcases, the aftermath of a marriage that had imploded spectacularly, taking most of my possessions with it. "You sure about this place?" Jake asked, as he helped me load my car. "Sounds sketchy as hell, man." "It's fine," I assured him, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. "Just a landlord who wants to rent quickly. Happens all the time." "If you say so," he replied, but his expression suggested he thought I was making a mistake. I drove back to Millfield Drive that night, my car loaded with everything I owned, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. As I pulled into the driveway, the house stood before me like a dark sentinel, its windows reflecting my headlights like watchful eyes. I carried my boxes inside by the light of my phone's flashlight, not wanting to figure out the light switches in the dark. The house felt different at night, not just darker, but somehow more alive, as if the shadows themselves were breathing. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet seemed amplified, echoing through the empty rooms like whispered warnings. I set up my air mattress in the master bedroom and unpacked a few essentials. As I arranged my toiletries in the bathroom, I noticed something odd. The medicine cabinet mirror had a hairline crack running diagonally from corner to corner, but it was so fine that I had to angle my head to see it clearly. Strange that I hadn't noticed it during my afternoon tour. By the time I was ready for sleep, it was past midnight. I lay on my air mattress, staring up at the ceiling, where shadows danced in the dim light filtering through the curtains. The house settled around me with creaks and groans that old houses make. but each sound seemed to carry an undertone of something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. I was just beginning to drift off when I heard it. A soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere downstairs. Tap, 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 like someone gently knocking on wood. I lay still, listening, telling myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps a tree branch scraping against a window. But the tapping continued, steady and purposeful, for nearly 5 minutes before stopping abruptly. Silence returned, heavy and expectant. I waited, straining my ears, but heard nothing more. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my anxiety, and I fell into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of empty chairs and cracked mirrors and the sound of something moving through the house in the darkness. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the bedroom windows, and the events of the night seemed like nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination and the stress of moving into a new place. I made coffee using the coffee maker I'd found in the kitchen, grateful that the previous tenant had left behind such conveniences. It was only when I went to get cream from the refrigerator that I noticed the photographs. They were held to the front of the fridge with magnets, family photos that the previous tenant had apparently forgotten to take. A middle-aged couple with 2 children, smiling at various locations, a beach, a restaurant, what looked like a graduation ceremony, normal family pictures, the kind everyone has. But in every single photograph, barely visible unless you looked closely, there was a 5th figure standing just at the edge of the frame, a tall, thin shadow that could have been a person, or could have been a trick of the light, or could have been something else entirely. I stared at the photos for a long time, my coffee growing cold in my hands, before finally convincing myself that I was seeing things that weren't there. Moving stress, I told myself. New environment anxiety. But as I went about my day, unpacking boxes and trying to make the house feel like home, I couldn't shake the feeling that those shadow figures in the photographs were watching me, waiting for something. And late that afternoon, as I sat in the living room reviewing some work emails, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was coming from upstairs. The tapping stopped the moment I started up the stairs. I paused on the landing, listening, but heard only the usual creaks and sighs of an old house. The afternoon light filtering through the stained glass window cast colorful patterns on the wallpaper, and everything looked perfectly normal. I felt foolish for being spooked by what was probably just pipes expanding or some other mundane explanation. Still, I found myself checking each room upstairs, looking for any obvious source of the sound. Nothing seemed out of place. The empty bedroom with its solitary chair looked exactly as I'd left it, the chair still positioned facing the window. I walked over and looked out at the backyard, wondering what view had compelled someone to place a chair in this exact spot. The yard was larger than I'd initially realized, stretching back toward a line of tall pine trees that formed a natural barrier between the property and whatever lay beyond. The grass was overgrown, dotted with the remnants of what had once been flower beds. In the center of the yard stood a large oak tree, its bare branches reaching toward the gray October sky like gnarled fingers. It was a perfectly ordinary suburban backyard, but something about it made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the shadows fell, or the fact that I couldn't see any neighboring houses through the pine trees, but standing at that window made me feel exposed, vulnerable, as if I were being watched from somewhere in that tangle of trees and shadows. I moved away from the window and went back downstairs, telling myself I was being ridiculous. I had work to catch up on, boxes to unpack, a life to rebuild. I didn't have time to be spooked by creaky houses and ordinary backyards. For the next few days, I fell into a routine. I worked from the dining room table, taking advantage of the reliable internet and the quiet atmosphere. The house was perfect for concentration, maybe too perfect. The silence was so complete that I found myself putting on music just to have some background noise, something to fill the oppressive quiet that seemed to press in around me. The tapping occurred sporadically, always when I was focused on something else, always stopping the moment I tried to locate its source. Sometimes it came from upstairs, sometimes from the basement, occasionally from the walls themselves. I began to suspect it was related to the heating system. Old houses often had noisy pipes, but I never could find a correlation between the sounds and the furnace cycling on and off. It was on my 4th night in the house that I first saw her. I was working late, trying to finish a project that was due the next morning, when I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision. I looked up from my laptop screen to see a figure standing at the top of the stairs, a woman in what appeared to be a white nightgown, her long dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. She was pale, almost translucent in the dim light from my laptop, and completely motionless. I couldn't make out her features clearly, but I had the distinct impression that she was looking directly at me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange and thin in the silence. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. We remained frozen in that tableau for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. And then I blinked, and she was gone. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty staircase, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. The rational part of my brain offered a dozen explanations. I was tired, stressed, still adjusting to the new environment. The shadows and angles of an unfamiliar house could play tricks on the eyes, especially late at night when you were staring at a computer screen. But I knew what I'd seen. I saved my work and closed the laptop, suddenly too tired to continue. As I made my way upstairs to bed, I found myself checking each room again, looking for any sign of an intruder, any evidence that someone else was in the house. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. In the master bedroom, I paused before the large mirror that hung above the antique dresser. My reflection looked back at me, tired, disheveled, more than a little paranoid. But for just a moment, I thought I saw something else in the glass, a pale figure standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. Sleep came fitfully that night. I dozed and woke repeatedly, each time with the feeling that I was being watched. Once I was certain I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room, slow and deliberate, but when I worked up the courage to check, I found nothing. The next morning brought a return of common sense. In the bright light of day, the previous night's events seemed like the product of an overactive imagination and too much caffeine. I'd been under a lot of stress lately, the divorce, the job situation, the move, and it was perfectly normal for that stress to manifest in strange ways. I decided to do some research on the house, partly out of curiosity and partly to reassure myself that there was nothing unusual about the property. A quick search of public records revealed that the house had been built in 1887 by a local merchant named Henry Millfield, who had apparently given his name to the street. The property had changed hands several times over the decades, which wasn't unusual for a house that old. What was more interesting was what I found when I dug deeper into the property's history. In 1923, a woman named Catherine Whitmore had died in the house under circumstances that the newspaper reports described as sudden and unexpected. The articles were frustratingly vague, offering no details about the cause of death or the specific circumstances. In 1956, another death, Margaret Price, found at the bottom of the main staircase with a broken neck. The newspaper called it a tragic accident, but mentioned that she had been alone in the house at the time, which raised questions about how such an accident could have occurred. More recently, in 1987, the Hendricks family had lived in the house for less than 6 months before moving out suddenly, leaving behind most of their possessions. A brief mention in the local paper's real estate section noted that the family had relocated due to personal reasons and that the house was available for rent immediately. I stared at the screen, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. 3 unexplained incidents spread across nearly a century. It could be coincidence, of course. People died in their homes all the time, especially elderly residents. Accidents happened. Families moved for any number of reasons. But the pattern was troubling. I was just about to close the browser when I found one more reference. This one from an online forum dedicated to local history. A user named Suburban Explorer had posted about the house just 2 years earlier. Does anyone know anything about the house at the end of Millfield Drive? I was doing some urban exploration in that area and noticed it's been empty for a while. Heard some weird stories about it from neighbors. Nothing specific, just that people don't tend to stay long. The replies were mostly unhelpful. Jokes about haunted houses and suggestions that the poster watched too many horror movies. But one response caught my attention. My cousin rented that place about 5 years ago. Lasted 3 weeks. Wouldn't talk about why he left. Just said something wasn't right about it. Still has nightmares, from what I hear. I closed the laptop with more force than necessary, frustrated with myself for going down this rabbit hole. So what if the house had an unusual history? Old houses often did, and internet forums were notorious for spreading rumors and urban legends. I was letting my imagination run away with me. But that evening, as I was making dinner in the kitchen, I heard the tapping again. This time it was different. Not the random, sporadic sounds I'd grown accustomed to, but a definite pattern. 3 quick taps, followed by 2 slow ones, repeated over and over. The sound was coming from directly above me, from what I knew was the empty bedroom. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed upstairs, determined to find a rational explanation. The hallway was dark despite the fact that I'd left the lights on when I'd come downstairs to cook. I flicked the switch, but nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out. The tapping continued as I approached the bedroom door, steady and rhythmic. I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight into the room. The chair was no longer facing the window. It had been turned around to face the door, positioned so that anyone sitting in it would be looking directly at whoever entered the room. And on the seat of the chair, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight, was the faint impression of someone having recently sat there, a slight depression in the wood that hadn't been there before. The tapping stopped. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding, the flashlight beam wavering in my unsteady hand. The room felt different, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I had the overwhelming sensation that I was not alone, that something was watching me from the shadows beyond my flashlight's reach. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer, but the silence felt expectant, as if something was waiting for me to step into the room, to cross some invisible threshold. I backed away from the door, my rational mind screaming at me that this was impossible, that chairs didn't move by themselves, that the depression in the seat could have been there all along, and I simply hadn't noticed it. But as I retreated down the hallway, I heard one final sound from the empty bedroom, the soft creak of wood under weight, as if someone had just stood up from the chair. I didn't sleep in the house that night. Instead, I packed a bag and drove to Jake's apartment, telling him I was having some electrical issues that needed to be sorted out. He seemed concerned, but didn't push for details, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't sure I could have explained what was happening without sounding completely insane. As I lay on Jake's couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to the normal sounds of city life outside, I tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone else had access to the house, a previous tenant who still had keys, or the landlord himself checking on the property. Maybe there were structural issues that caused the floors to shift, moving furniture and creating strange sounds. But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen and heard, I couldn't shake the image of that chair turned to face the door, waiting for me in the darkness. And I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, the sense that something in that house was aware of my presence and was not pleased by it. When morning came, I knew I had to go back. I had nowhere else to go, and I couldn't afford to lose the deposit I'd paid. But more than that, I needed to understand what was happening. Running away wouldn't answer any questions, and I'd spent too much of my life running from problems already. As I drove back to Millfield Drive, I made a decision. If something was in that house with me, I was going to find out what it wanted. I just hoped I was prepared for the answer. The house looked different when I returned the next morning. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, but something was off. The windows seemed darker, the shadows deeper, as if the building itself had somehow diminished overnight. Even the October morning light, weak as it was, seemed reluctant to touch the walls. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the front door and trying to work up the courage to go inside. Everything looked normal, perfectly, almost aggressively normal. But my gut was telling me to drive away, to cut my losses and find somewhere else to live. Instead, I got out of the car and walked to the front door, keys jingling in my trembling hand. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. The house had always had a faint mustiness, the inevitable result of age and questionable ventilation, but now there was something else underneath it, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. The second thing I noticed was that every door in the house was open. I distinctly remembered closing the bedroom doors before I'd left the previous evening, a habit I'd developed from years of apartment living. But now they all stood open, revealing dark rectangles that seemed to watch me as I moved through the house. I checked each room methodically, looking for signs of an intruder. But nothing appeared to be missing or disturbed. My laptop was still on the dining room table where I'd left it. My clothes were still folded in the bedroom dresser. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for the doors and the chair. The chair in the empty bedroom had been moved again. This time it was positioned directly in the center of the room, facing not the window or the door, but the wall where a full-length mirror hung, as if someone had been sitting there staring at their own reflection, or staring at someone else's. I approached the mirror cautiously, half expecting to see something other than my own face, looking back at me. But the reflection showed only me, pale and tired, standing in an empty room with a misplaced chair. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was wrong somehow, not cracked or distorted, but off, as if the reflection it showed was delayed by just a fraction of a second, creating a subtle disconnect between my movements and what I saw in the glass. I reached out to touch the mirror's surface, and for one horrible moment, I was certain that the reflection wouldn't reach out to meet me, that I would see my hand move while my reflection remained still. But the reflection moved normally, and my fingers met cold glass. I backed away, feeling foolish, but unable to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. Whatever was happening in this house, I was clearly losing my grip on reality. Maybe the stress of the move and the divorce was finally catching up with me. Maybe I needed to see a doctor, get some medication to help me sleep. But even as I tried to rationalize my experiences, I found myself taking photos of the chair's position with my phone, documenting its exact placement. If I was going crazy, at least I'd have evidence of my delusions. The rest of the day passed without incident. I worked at the dining room table, answered emails, made phone calls, tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The house remained quiet, almost sullen, as if it were holding its breath. It wasn't until evening that things began to escalate. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard the sound of water running upstairs. Not an unusual sound in itself. Old pipes sometimes made noise when the pressure changed, but this was clearly the sound of a faucet running at full force. I went upstairs to investigate and found that the bathtub in the main bathroom was filling with water. The taps were turned on full, and steam was rising from the surface, indicating that both hot and cold water were running. I turned off the taps and stared at the tub, which was already half full. The water was crystal clear, but as I watched, I noticed something floating just beneath the surface, dark strands that moved with the current, spreading out like ink in water. Hair, long, dark hair, exactly like I'd seen on the figure at the top of the stairs. I plunged my hand into the water to grab the hair, but my fingers closed on nothing. The strands had vanished, leaving only clear, hot water that burned my skin. I drained the tub and checked the taps multiple times to make sure they were completely closed. There was no logical explanation for how they could have turned on by themselves, but I was running out of logical explanations for anything that had happened in this house. That night, I made a decision. I would stay awake, keep vigil, and see if I could catch whatever was responsible for these disturbances. I positioned myself on the living room couch with a clear view of the staircase and settled in to wait. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The house was silent except for the usual creaks and groans of settling wood. I kept myself alert with coffee and nervous energy, jumping at every shadow, every shift in the quality of light. It was just after 2 a.m. when I heard the footsteps. They started upstairs, in what sounded like the master bedroom. Slow, deliberate steps across the hardwood floor, back and forth, as if someone were pacing. I grabbed my flashlight and crept up the stairs, trying to move as quietly as possible. The footsteps continued, unhurried and rhythmic, never pausing or changing pace. They seemed to be coming from my bedroom, but when I reached the landing, they stopped. I pushed open the bedroom door and shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty, but the air was frigid, so cold I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. And on the hardwood floor, clearly visible in the dust that had accumulated despite my cleaning efforts, were footprints. Bare feet, small and delicate, leading from the bed to the window and back again. The same path, repeated over and over, worn deep into the dust like a trail created by endless repetition. I followed the footprints with my flashlight beam, noting how they seemed to glow faintly in the light, as if they were somehow more real than the rest of the room. At the window, the prints paused, and I could see where toes had pressed into the dust, as if someone had stood there for a long time, looking out into the darkness, looking out at the oak tree in the backyard, whose bare branches were now swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footprints were real. I had physical evidence now that something was in this house with me, something that walked and paced and left traces of its presence. But as I stood in the hallway, trying to process what I'd seen, I heard a new sound from downstairs, the soft creak of the front door opening. I raced down the stairs, flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of me. But the front door was closed and locked, exactly as I'd left it. I checked the locks twice, tested the knob, even looked outside to see if anyone was on the porch. Nothing. But when I turned around, every door in the house was open again. And from the kitchen came the sound of water running. I found all the taps turned on full force. Kitchen sink, bathroom sinks, the bathtub upstairs. Water was pouring out everywhere, and the same dark hair was swirling in every basin, more substantial now, more visible. As I moved from room to room, turning off taps and watching the hair dissolve into nothing, I began to understand that whatever was happening here was escalating. The presence in the house was becoming bolder, more active, as if it were gaining strength or confidence. And it was focused on water. I thought about the research I'd done, about Catherine Whitmore, who had died suddenly and unexpectedly in 1923. I thought about Margaret Price, found at the bottom of the stairs with a broken neck. I thought about the families who had left suddenly, the tenants who lasted only weeks before fleeing, and I thought about the figure in the white nightgown, pale and translucent, who had watched me from the top of the stairs. When I finally went back to bed that night, I left every light in the house on. I locked the bedroom door and pushed the dresser in front of it, creating a barrier that would at least slow down anyone or anything that tried to enter. But as I lay on my air mattress, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me, I realized that locks and barriers were useless against something that could turn on taps and move furniture and leave footprints in the dust. I was sharing this house with something that didn't belong to the world of the living, and it was becoming increasingly clear that it didn't want me here. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Outside my window, the oak tree continued to sway in its silent wind, and somewhere in the house, I could hear the sound of water dripping, like a countdown to something I didn't want to imagine. I found the photographs on my fourth morning in the house. They were scattered across the dining room table when I came downstairs, black and white images that looked like they'd been taken decades ago. I was certain the table had been clear when I'd gone to bed, but there they were, dozens of photographs spread out like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The images showed the house in different eras, some from what appeared to be the 1920s, others from the 1950s, a few that might have been from the 1980s, based on the clothing and hairstyles of the people in the backgrounds. Different families, different time periods, but all sharing the same setting, this house. And in every single photograph, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was the same figure, a woman in white, standing just at the edge of the frame, her face always turned away from the camera. Sometimes she was in a doorway, sometimes reflected in a mirror, sometimes just a pale smudge in a dark corner that might have been dismissed as a photographic flaw. But I knew better now. I gathered the photographs with trembling hands, studying each one carefully. The woman appeared in family portraits, holiday gatherings, even candid shots of children playing in the backyard. She was always there, always watching, a constant presence that spanned decades. In one photograph, from what looked like the 1950s, I could see her more clearly than in the others. She stood at the top of the staircase, her long dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders, her white nightgown flowing around her like water. Her face was turned toward the camera, but her features were blurred, as if she'd been moving when the shutter clicked, or as if she wasn't quite solid enough to be captured clearly by the camera. I spent the morning arranging the photographs chronologically, trying to piece together a timeline. The earliest images showed a young woman, barely more than a girl, As the decades progressed, her appearance remained unchanged while the people around her aged, had children, grew old, and disappeared. By afternoon, I knew I had to search the basement more thoroughly. There had to be more clues down there, more pieces to this puzzle. I'd only given it a cursory look when I'd first toured the house, but now I needed to examine every corner. The basement stairs creaked ominously under my weight as I descended with my flashlight, the single bulb hanging from the ceiling providing barely enough illumination to see by. The stone walls seemed to press in around me, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something sweet and rotting that made my stomach turn. I started with the shelves along the walls, moving aside paint cans and old tools to look behind them. Most of what I found was exactly what you'd expect in a basement: forgotten household items, broken furniture, boxes of Christmas decorations from families long gone. But in the far corner, hidden behind a stack of moldy cardboard boxes, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a wooden chest, ornate and old, with brass fittings that had turned green with age. The wood was warped and water-stained, as if it had been submerged at some point, and when I lifted the lid, the smell of decay became overwhelming. Inside were more photographs, but these were different from the ones I'd found upstairs. These were older, some dating back to the late 1800s, and they showed a progression that told a story I wished I didn't understand. The earliest photographs showed a young woman, the same woman from the other images, but alive, vibrant, standing next to a man I recognized from my research as Henry Millfield, the original owner of the house. Wedding photos, family portraits, pictures of a couple building a life together. But as the photographs progressed chronologically, something changed. The woman's smile became forced, her posture tense. In several images, I could see bruises on her arms, marks that had been carelessly hidden by long sleeves and high collars. The man's expression grew darker, more possessive, and in the later photographs, the woman looked genuinely afraid. The final photographs in the chest were the most disturbing. They showed the woman alone, gaunt and hollow-eyed, her white nightgown hanging loose on her emaciated frame. In the last image, she was standing by the oak tree in the backyard, and hanging from one of the branches was a noose. But it was what I found beneath the photographs that truly terrified me. Wrapped in an oiled cloth, preserved after all these years, was a leather-bound journal. The pages were yellow and brittle, but the ink was still legible. It was written in a woman's handwriting, delicate but increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. The first entry was dated October 15th, 1888. Henry says I must not leave the house alone. He says it is for my protection, that a woman of my standing should not be seen wandering the streets without escort. But I feel more like a prisoner than a wife. The house feels smaller each day, as if the walls are closing in around me. I read entry after entry, watching as the woman's life grew smaller and more constrained. Henry Millfield had been a controlling man, increasingly paranoid and possessive. He'd forbidden her from having visitors, from leaving the house, from writing letters to her family. November 3rd, 1888. Henry has removed the mirrors from my room. He says I spend too much time looking at myself. That vanity is a sin. But I think he fears what I might see in the glass. I think he fears that I might see the truth of what he has made me become. The entries became darker, more desperate. The woman whose name I learned was Catherine Whitmore Millfield described feeling watched, followed, as if Henry's control over her had become so complete that she couldn't escape it, even when he wasn't physically present. December 22nd. I tried to leave today, while Henry was in town on business. But I could not make myself open the front door. It was as if some invisible force was holding me back, keeping me trapped in this house like a bird in a cage. I fear I am losing my mind. The final entries were written in a different hand, shakier and more erratic. January 10th, 1889. Henry is dead. Heart failure, the doctor says. Though he was a young man and seemed healthy, I should feel free now, but I do not. I feel more trapped than ever, as if his death has somehow made my prison stronger instead of weaker. January 18th, 1889. I cannot leave. I have tried and tried, but every time I approach the door, I am filled with such terror that I cannot breathe. It is as if something is holding me here, binding me to this place. Henry's love was a curse, and his death has made that curse eternal. January 25th, 1889. I understand now. Love and possession, when taken to their extremes, become the same thing. Henry loved me so completely that he could not bear the thought of me existing without him, and somehow, in dying, he has found a way to keep me here forever. I am his still, even in death. I will always be his. The final entry was barely legible, the handwriting deteriorating into desperate scrawls. I have found the only way out. The oak tree in the garden. If I cannot leave this house alive, perhaps I can find peace in death. But I fear that even death will not free me. I fear that I will be trapped here always, bound to this place by chains stronger than love, stronger than death itself. I sat in the basement for a long time, holding the journal and trying to process what I'd learned. Catherine Whitmore had died by her own hand, but not before understanding that she was trapped by something beyond the physical world. Henry Millfield's obsessive love had somehow transcended death, creating a prison that held her spirit in the house they'd shared. But that didn't explain why she was tormenting the living residents. Unless I thought about the pattern I'd observed, the way her manifestations had grown stronger over time, the way she seemed to be studying me, watching me, following my movements through the house. What if she wasn't trying to drive me away? What if she was trying to join me? The thought sent ice through my veins. I scrambled up the basement stairs, suddenly desperate to get out of that enclosed space, away from the moldy smell and the oppressive weight of tragedy. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard the sound that had become all too familiar, the soft tapping that echoed through the house. This time, it was coming from the front door. I approached cautiously, knowing that I would find no one there, knowing that the door would be locked and secure. But the tapping continued, urgent and insistent, as if someone were desperately trying to get in, or trying to get out. I pressed my hand against the door and felt it vibrate with each tap. The wood was ice cold, so cold that frost was forming around the edges of the frame. "Catherine," I whispered, feeling foolish but needing to know. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the house was completely silent. Then, so softly, I almost missed it. I heard a voice, a woman's voice, thin and distant, as if it were coming from very far away. "Help me." That was when I realized the terrible truth. Catherine wasn't trying to scare me away from the house. She was trying to escape with me. But if Henry's possessive love had been strong enough to trap her for over a century, what would happen if she tried to leave? What would he do to anyone who tried to help her? As if in answer to my thoughts, the temperature in the house plummeted. My breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began to form on the windows. The lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. And from somewhere in the house, from everywhere in the house, came the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps that shook the floorboards and rattled the windows. Someone else was coming. Someone who was very, very angry. The footsteps were coming from upstairs, but they weren't the light, barefoot steps I'd grown accustomed to. These were heavy boots, pounding across the floor with the fury of someone or something that had been contained for far too long. I stood frozen in the hallway, the journal still clutched in my hands as the temperature continued to drop. Ice was forming on the inside of the windows now, and my breath came out in clouds that dissipated slowly in the motionless air. The footsteps paused directly above me, and I could hear the floorboards groaning under an enormous weight. Then came a new sound, furniture being overturned, objects crashing to the floor, as if someone were tearing apart the rooms upstairs in a violent rage. I knew I should run. Every instinct screamed at me to drop the journal and flee the house before whatever was upstairs decided to come down and find me. But Catherine's voice, "Help me," echoed in my memory, and I found myself unable to abandon her to whatever fate awaited her here. Instead, I forced myself to climb the stairs. The hallway upstairs was a disaster zone. Pictures had been torn from the walls, their frames smashed, and glass scattered across the floor. The antique furniture had been overturned or broken, and deep gouges in the wallpaper suggested that something with claws or fingers strong enough to tear through plaster had raked across the walls in fury. The worst damage was in the master bedroom. The four-poster bed had been reduced to splinters, the mattress torn open, and its stuffing scattered like snow. The mirror above the dresser was shattered, but the pieces remained in the frame, creating a fractured reflection that multiplied everything into distorted fragments. And standing in the center of the destruction, barely visible but unmistakably present, was a tall figure in a dark suit. Henry Millfield looked exactly as he had in the photographs from the 1880s. A man in his 30s with a strong jaw and cold eyes. But there was something wrong with him, something that made my vision swim when I tried to focus on his face. He seemed to flicker between solid and transparent, as if he were caught between worlds and couldn't decide which one to inhabit. When he spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, distorted and echoing with the weight of over a century. "She is mine," he said, and the words seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "She will always be mine. No one can take her from me." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, Catherine appeared. She materialized beside the broken bed, her white nightgown flowing around her like mist. In the physical presence of her husband, she looked even more translucent than before, as if his proximity was somehow draining her substance. "Please," she whispered, and her voice was like wind through dry leaves. "I've been trapped here so long. I just want to rest." Henry turned toward her, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. When he moved, reality seemed to bend around him, walls shifting and floors tilting, as if the house itself were recoiling from his presence. "You tried to leave me once before," he said, and now his voice carried the rumble of distant thunder. "I will not allow it to happen again." I watched in horror as chains began to appear around Catherine's wrists and ankles. Not physical chains, but something darker, made of shadow and malice. They wrapped around her like living things, binding her to the spot where she stood. "She's suffered enough," I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "You've kept her here for over a century. Let her go." Henry's attention fixed on me, and I felt the full weight of his fury. The air around me became so cold that ice crystals began forming on my clothes, and the pressure in my ears built until I thought my head might explode. "You would steal her from me?" he asked. his form becoming more solid, more menacing. "You would take what is mine." "She was never yours to take," I said, though every word was an effort against the supernatural force pressing down on me. Love doesn't mean ownership. Marriage doesn't mean slavery. The house shook with Henry's rage. Windows shattered in their frames, and the floorboards buckled and warped. But Catherine was looking at me now with something like hope in her pale eyes. "The tree," she whispered urgently. "The oak tree. That's where it started. That's where it can end." I understood immediately. The rope, the final act of desperation that had ended her life, but also the place where Henry's binding had begun. If there was a way to break the supernatural chains that held her, it would be there. "Come with me," I said, extending my hand toward her. But as she reached out to take it, Henry's roar of fury nearly brought the ceiling down. The chains around Catherine tightened, and she cried out in pain as they began to drag her backward, away from me. "You cannot have her," Henry bellowed, his form now fully solid and towering over us both. "She chose to stay with me in death. She is bound by her own choice." "I never chose this," Catherine screamed back, the first real emotion I'd heard from her. "I chose death to escape you, not to be with you. You trapped me here against my will." The admission seemed to hit Henry like a physical blow. For a moment his form flickered and became less substantial, and the chains around Catherine loosened slightly. That was our chance. I lunged forward and grabbed Catherine's hand, feeling the shock of supernatural cold that shot up my arm. Her fingers were like ice, and touching her was like grasping electricity, but I held on. "The tree," I gasped. "We have to get to the tree." Together, we ran from the room as Henry's roar of fury shook the entire house. The hallway stretched before us, but it was changing as we moved through it, walls shifting and doors multiplying in an attempt to confuse and trap us. Henry was rewriting reality itself to prevent our escape. I focused on the staircase, pulling Catherine behind me as the house fought against us. The stairs tried to elongate beneath our feet, becoming an endless spiral that led nowhere. But I refused to be deterred. I thought about the journal entries, about Catherine's desperate desire for freedom, and somehow that gave me the strength to push through Henry's illusions. We reached the front door, but it was sealed shut. The wood fused together as if it had never been separate pieces. I could hear Henry coming down the stairs behind us, his footsteps like thunder, the house groaning under the weight of his fury. "The back door," Catherine whispered, and we turned toward the kitchen. But the back door was gone entirely, replaced by solid wall. Every exit had been removed, every window sealed. Henry had made the house into a perfect prison. "There's no way out," I said, despair creeping into my voice. "There is," Catherine said, her grip tightening on my hand. "Through there." She pointed to the basement door, and I understood. The basement extended under the back porch. There might be a way to reach the backyard through the foundation. We plunged down the basement stairs as Henry's presence filled the kitchen above us, his rage making the house shake like it was caught in an earthquake. The basement was our only refuge, but I knew it wouldn't protect us for long. I searched frantically along the stone walls, looking for any opening, any crack that might lead outside. Catherine stood beside me, her form becoming more solid now that we were away from Henry's immediate presence. "There," she said, pointing to a section of wall that looked different from the rest. "That's where the old root cellar used to be. It connects to the outside." I could see it now, a rectangle of newer stone that had been used to seal up an older opening. The mortar was crumbling with age, and some of the stones were loose. I began pulling at the stones with my bare hands, ignoring the pain as my fingers scraped against the rough edges. Catherine tried to help, but her ghostly form could barely interact with the physical world. Behind us, I could hear Henry descending the stairs, his footsteps slow and deliberate, now that he knew we were trapped. "She will never leave this house," his voice echoed through the basement. "And neither will you." I pulled harder at the stones, and suddenly a section of the wall gave way, revealing a narrow tunnel that led up toward the surface. Cold air flowed through the opening, carrying the scent of earth and autumn leaves. "Go," I said to Catherine. "Get to the tree." "Not without you," she replied. "If you stay here, he'll kill you, and then you'll be trapped here too." She was right. I could feel Henry's influence growing stronger as he approached, could sense that he was perfectly capable of adding me to his collection of prisoners. I squeezed through the opening, Catherine following close behind. The tunnel was narrow and filled with roots and debris, but it led upward toward freedom. I crawled through darkness, guided only by the flow of cold air and Catherine's whispered directions. We emerged behind the house, near the edge of the overgrown garden. The oak tree stood before us, its bare branches reaching toward the gray October sky, like the arms of a supplicant. But Henry was already there, waiting for us. He stood beneath the tree, his form now completely solid, and radiating cold that turned the ground around him white with frost. In his hand was a rope, the same rope Catherine had used to end her life over a century ago. "You will hang again," he said to Catherine, his voice carrying the finality of judgment. "And this time, you will understand that death brings no escape from love." "That's not love," I said, stepping between them. "That's obsession. That's madness." Henry's attention turned to me, and I felt the full force of his supernatural fury, but I stood my ground, thinking about everything I'd learned about this man and his twisted relationship with his wife. "You kept her prisoner when she was alive," I continued. "You made her life a hell of isolation and control, and when she chose death over life with you, you trapped her spirit here to continue your abuse. That's not love, that's evil." "She is mine," Henry repeated. But there was something different in his voice now, a note of uncertainty. "No," Catherine said, stepping forward. "I never was. I was a person, not a possession. I had thoughts and feelings and dreams that had nothing to do with you. I was trying to tell you that when I was alive, but you never listened." Henry's form flickered, becoming less substantial. "You're holding her here against her will," I said. "You're perpetuating the same crime you committed in life, but you have a choice now. You can let her go, let her find peace, and find some redemption for yourself. Or," Catherine added, her voice stronger now, more certain, "you can continue to be the monster you always were." For a moment, Henry seemed to consider this. His form wavered between solid and translucent, and the supernatural cold that surrounded him began to fade. But then his face hardened, and he raised the rope. "She will not leave me," he said with finality. That's when I realized there was only one way this could end. I stepped forward and put my arms around Catherine, pulling her ghostly form against me. She felt like mist and moonlight, but I held her tight and whispered, "I believe you deserve to be free." The simple act of acceptance, of validation, seemed to break something fundamental in Henry's power. The chains that bound Catherine began to crack and fade, and her form became brighter, more real. Henry lunged toward us with the rope, but his form was already fading, without Catherine's forced presence to anchor him to the physical world. His own spirit was being drawn away, pulled toward whatever judgment awaited him. "No," he screamed as he dissolved into shadows. "She is mine. She will always be mine." But his voice was already distant, echoing as if it came from a great depth. Catherine looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd seen her, she was smiling. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she too began to fade. But this was different. This was peaceful, voluntary. She was choosing to leave, to move on to whatever came after. "Will you be all right?" I asked. "I'll be free," she said. "For the first time in over a century, I'll be free." She faded completely, leaving me standing alone beneath the oak tree in the cold October afternoon. The house behind me looked different now. Smaller, more ordinary, just an old Victorian that needed some maintenance, nothing more. The oppressive atmosphere that had pressed down on me for days was gone, replaced by the normal silence of an empty house. I walked back inside and found that everything had returned to normal. The furniture was back in place, the mirrors unbroken, the walls unmarked. It was as if the supernatural battle had never happened. I packed my belongings and left that afternoon, calling Mr. Garrett to tell him I was moving out for personal reasons. He seemed unsurprised and didn't ask for details. A week later, I found a small apartment across town. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, and it was free of ghosts. Sometimes, on quiet October evenings, I think about Catherine and hope that she found the peace she'd been seeking for so long. And sometimes, I remember that not all prisons are made of bars and walls. Some are made of love that has curdled into possession, of relationships that become cages. But I also learned that freedom is possible, even from the strongest chains. If someone is willing to stand up and say, "This is wrong, you deserve better, you deserve to be free." The house on Millfield Drive still stands empty, and according to the real estate listings, it's been on the market ever since I left. The price keeps dropping, but no one seems interested in buying it, which is probably for the best. Some stories, once they're finished, should be allowed to end.